For chapter 5, we're going to go a little beyond that. We're going to start looking at what changes the slope of those curves, what impact it has on P and Q. Let me get some information pulled up over here. Share the screen. Okay. This is chapter 5. In chapter 5, we're going to focus on elasticity, which is, as I said, is responsiveness of X to changes in Y. As a business, we need to know the elasticity of our product. Is it an elastic demand curve or an inelastic demand curve? Here are some elasticities, and we can see how the businesses respond and the consumers respond. And all these are for the demand curve. So on the first one, on the first curve, we have a perfectly inelastic curve. So it doesn't matter how much the product costs, we still want to buy it. Let's say that we're looking at COVID now. If somebody comes up with a cure for COVID, and it's guaranteed that you'll become immune, and if you're sick, you will be able to recover. If they're $10 a piece and you have to have 2 pills, you're still going to want 2 pills. If it's $100 a pill, you're going to want 2 pills. 1,000, you want 2 pills. In that case, the demand curve is perfectly inelastic. We as consumers will buy it at whatever price they present it at. We don't see a whole lot of those. Now, here we see a curve that's both elastic and inelastic. Up at the top, if we change the price, we'll see a little change in quantity, but if we go to the bottom, we'll see the opposite. As we look at later graphs, you'll be able to understand more of what's going on. And as this one says, if there's a 22% increase in price, you will see an 11% decrease in quantity. That's an inelastic curve. When the quantity don't respond equal to or above the price change, it's inelastic. As we can see here, we'll change the price here and it doesn't matter at all. Here we have a unit elastic demand. 22% increase in price will lead to a 22% decrease in quantity demanded. That's where we want to be. Because as we'll see a little later on when we calculate elasticity, we want to produce at the level of elasticity demand is equal to 1. That's where we can sell everything we want and the consumer will buy everything we produce. So this is an ideal situation here. It says elasticity is equal to 1. If we look at the graphs toward the bottom, these are elastic in nature. The first one is elastic demand. If we change the price 22%, we'll see a 67% change in quantity. That is elastic. Because if we go the other way, if we reduce the price 22%, we'll see a 67% gain in the units sold. So if I have a curve, if I'm a business and I know my curve is elastic in nature, I have to be very careful when I start raising my pricing. As I raise the price, I'm going to see more and more units fail to sell. Consumers will bubble their dollars and leave it on the shelf. In a perfectly elastic situation, it doesn't matter what the quantity is. If, for instance, it's whatever it may be at $4, if the price is $4, the consumer will consume an infinite supply of those products. If the price is greater than 4, we consume 0. Because if the market is selling it at 4 and somebody wants to sell it at $4.25, we'll just look across the street or go down the road and get it at 4. If the price is below 4, I'll consume an infinite supply, or the consumers will consume everything that's produced. Well, that's at least what is perceived. So in looking at this, if I'm a producer of this good, whatever it may be, I'm not going to sell it at $3.80. I'm going to sell it at $4. Because that's what the market demand is telling me. I'm not going to charge $4.01. I'm not going to charge $3.99. I'm going to charge $4. So this is a description, and it shows the inelastic curve and the elastic curve. In this graph, they're wanting to show us total revenue. And total revenue equals P times Q. If this is our point of production and we're charging $4, and at $4 we can sell 100 units, our profit is $400. But this is assuming that this is where we want to produce. That's where elasticity demand is equal to 1 or near 1. It's just like the equilibrium. This is a moving target. But if your curve is inelastic, if you know that your curve is inelastic, gasoline, your curve is inelastic. As long as you don't go too far, you will sell everything you put on the marketplace. Consumer is not real concerned with the price to a certain point. So this is the calculation of total revenue. Now I want to bring up, this is some old notes. I had a student that was taking notes for a disabled student. So this is some of the notes that they had. And I asked him to give it to me so I could use it at a later date. When we look at elasticity, we said it's the responsiveness of X to changes in Y. For testing purposes, you're going to have to understand how to calculate elasticity. You're going to have to know how to calculate total revenue. Both of them are important. In this page, and I'll probably share this document with the class. Now, realizing this is about 10 years old in a different publisher, the determinants are different, or the shifters are different. You have to stay with Mankiw on what he says happens, supply and demand. But a lot of them are the same, income of buyers, et cetera, et cetera. But here's the formula. The elasticity of demand equals the absolute value of the percent change in quantity over the percent change in price. If we understand the relationship between total revenue and elasticity, and we'll see the two graphs, one on top of the other. If we can just see the total revenue curve and determine if it's greater than 1, equal to 1, or less than 1. In fact, we just look at the calculations for total revenue. If elasticity demand is greater than 1, total revenue is increasing. If elasticity demand is less than 1, the total revenue is decreasing. So to do the calculations, anytime they give you something like this on the test, they're only going to give you maybe 1 or 2 data sets. Let's see if I can draw on this. It doesn't appear so. No. But I'll draw it out on the whiteboard momentarily. When we calculate elasticity and total revenue, we're going to create 2 graphs. And as I said, with the test, they're only going to give you 1 or 2 data sets, and that's fine. If they want to know what the elasticity is between a price of 1 and the price of 4 with quantity of 1 and quantity of 2, we should be able to calculate it. If they want to know if revenues are increasing or decreasing, we should be able to look right here. And as we move from left to right on the quantity axis, the x-axis, we see that total revenue is increasing. You can see what's happening right here. Total revenue is increasing when elasticity demand is greater than 1. So if they just give us one data set, just these 2 items here, and they ask if it's elastic or inelastic, you should be able to determine that by doing the math, moving from left to right on the data set. So it doesn't matter if they give you B first or A first. If you put the Q's in order, you'll know whether it's elastic or inelastic. Because if you see this number goes up, it's elastic. If you see the number go down, it's inelastic. So we looked at the formula. And as we calculate elasticity from left to right on the demand curve, using the formula where elasticity demand is equal to the absolute value of percent change in quantity over price. If we're moving from left to right and we look at the data up here, our quantity is increasing. So what we're going to do when we do the calculation for this problem, we're going to go 2 minus 1. That's going to give us the distance between these 2 intervals. 2 minus 1 is equal to 1. We bring that right over here. And then we have to, this is called the midpoint formula. Midpoint formula. Then we need to add the 2 together and divide by 2 because we want to know the average. So all we're going to do is 2 plus 1 equals 3 divided by 2 is 1.5. That's what we see here in the equation. Whatever we do with the x, we got to do it with the y. In that same interval, the price went, as this went up, went down, increased, the price went down. So it's going to be 5 minus 4 over 5 plus 4 divided by 2. That's exactly what I did here. Simple math, multiply by the reciprocal. So 1 times 4.5 over 1.5 times 1 is 4.5 over 1.5, which gives you an answer of 3. That tells me between A and B, between these two intervals, that they were so marked. If I change the price 1%, I'll see a 3% gain in quantity. So it's to my benefit to go ahead and produce the additional goods at the lower price and increase my total revenue. So it would move from here to roughly here. That's an increase in total revenue. Whatever I did in the first interval, I'm going to do with the second. So it would be 3 minus 2, which is 1, over 3 plus 2, which is 2.5, divided by 4 minus 3 is 1, over 4 plus 3 divided by 2, which is 3.5. So multiply by the reciprocal is going to be 2.5 divided by 3.5. It gives us a final answer of 1.4. So at this point between B and C, not at B or C, but between B and C, that's the reason it's called a midpoint formula, the elasticity demand is 1.4. Now it's not a major jump in quantity. However, it is an increase. So if we change the price 1%, we'll see a 1.4% change in quantity. So it is our benefit to reduce the price and increase the quantity. Because if you look down below, we see that the total revenue curve is still increasing. But it's increasing to a point, because this is basically a parabola. We can break this nonlinear curve into two parts. On the left-hand side, it's increasing at a decreasing rate. And then it transitions to decreasing at an increasing rate. And we see that it's decreasing when we do the calculation for elasticity. From D to C, 4 minus 3 over 4 plus 3. So that's going to be 1 over 3.5 divided by 3 minus 2 is 1, 3 plus 2 is 5, plus, divided by 2 is 2.5. So we're going to do the math. It's going to end up being 2.5 over 3.5, which is going to be 0.714. It is now telling us if we lower the price, we're going to give up quantity. We'll lower the price and we'll sell additional units, but our total revenue is decreasing. And it's decreasing at a decreasing rate. Okay? So if you understand the movement of TR, and if they give you the data sets, even if it's just one data set, as long as you put it in the proper order, because I guarantee you they'll put it in the incorrect order. They'll say at a price of 4, they want 2, and the price of 5, they want 1. Don't let them trick you. We're going from left to right on the demand curve, not right to left. So whenever they give you a data set, make sure you put it in order, in the proper order. Any questions about it?
No, sir.
As I said, this is from way back. So I think my textbook then was Ball and Bentham, which is the one I used in grad school. But I'm going to share this with you. Go to share. Yes. Oh, share file, excuse me. So if you want to take this old study guide and look at it, the basic principles are still the same. There's just some terminology differences. But it should help you with the calculation of elasticity and so forth. You just have to take the time. Okay? So any questions so far? Let's go back to the PowerPoint. I said this is the elasticity. Well, we're going to look at the total revenue and the calculations at each point on the curve. If you can set it up as a separate graph if you want, but you still know how to calculate total revenue, which is P times Q. Now, they're going to calculate total revenue for each one of these nonlinear curves. And on this one, we see an inelastic curve. So the point where elasticity is equal to 1 is somewhere up here. Because if we raise the price, we see very little change in quantity. So if the elasticity demand is, I got to get back to, excuse me, I'm looking at the wrong one. Okay. Okay. In both of these, we have we have an elastic curve and an inelastic curve. As I said, the point where elasticity demand is equal to 1 is somewhere up in here. And we can calculate the total revenue at each point. So at a price of 400, our profit is $400 or $400, yes. That's what our income will be, our total revenue. Now, if we raise the price to 5, we'll see a change. It'll go to 190. Well, go up $1 and down to 90 quantity. And they show us up here where it goes step by step what we're looking at. So in this case, we see a decrease in quantity and an increase in price on this inelastic curve. We should see an increase in total revenue because it goes from 400 to 450. So as a business, I want to make sure that I take advantage of this. If the consumers are going to buy the units at $5, $6, and $7, that's what I'm going to sell them at. So in this case, I'm going to reduce the quantity and increase the price. Now on the other side, we have an elastic curve. And it starts out the same way. 4 times 100 is 400. That's our total revenue. If we raise the price by $1, just like we did over on the inelastic curve, we'll see a 30-unit drop on quantity. So when we do the math, we go from $400 total revenue to $350 total revenue. So if we're on the elastic side of the curve, we need to be making sure we lower the price, not raise the price. Our objective is getting to the point where elasticity demand is equal to 1. Okay, that's what it's showing us here. Now this one, we're going with a percent change. So we see the price and quantity established. There's nothing at 7 and 0 because if you multiply 7 times 0, it's undefined. But when we lower price by $1, we see the quantity go up by 2. And our total revenue to 12. Accordingly, we see the elasticity as 3.7. Now, this textbook, they simplify the calculations by just looking at the percent change in price over the percent change in quantity. And then they divide those two units. But in reality, you're actually going to be a little off with the numbers. You're more accurate if you use the midpoint formula. But this still works. And we can tell that the elasticity demand is greater than 1, because as we move from left to right on the demand curve on the quantity axis, we can see that our total revenue is increasing. And it continues to increase at 4 to 6, but at 3 to 8, we see it level off. Now, this is 6 and this is 8. It doesn't come up this level out and go across and down. It is a parabola. So there's going to be a continuous arc all the way across. We'll find the point where elasticity demand is equal to 1 between those 2 points. So if you ever do the calculation for total revenue, it goes up and you see a duplication of the number at the top and then it goes downward. When you calculate your total your elasticity, it's going to be 1. Okay? So it would be between a quantity of 6 and 8. That's where we're going to be. Now, if you don't have the duplication number, it just goes up, say 12, 20, 24, 20, 12. It's going to be at the point where you have your highest number. So it's really important you know the relationship between the total revenue and elasticity. You can see here we're unit elastic. That means we're at 1. So if they just use that term, unit elasticity, they're looking for the point where elasticity is equal to 1. It doesn't matter if they're calculating elasticity for supply or demand, or it doesn't matter. They're still looking for the point where it's equal to 1. As a business, that's where I hope the supply and demand curve equal and create an equilibrium. Here, we're going to supply. And there's been a discussion between economists for a long time about a positive slope on the supply curve. If we look at who has the most information in a marketplace, it's not going to normally the consumer, it's going to be the supplier of goods. So they're keenly aware of the demand curve, the elasticity demand curve. They know they're consumers, they know where certain markets function in one way and others in a different way. They're keenly aware of their markets. That's how they stay in business. So in reality, there shouldn't be a positive slope. And the discussion is the only way that the slope of the supply curve is positive is because someone is being fooled or deceived. If it's a product you only buy once in a blue moon, they could change the price, you'd never know it. Now, if it's table salt, you just ignore it. I mean, that's the reason it's the bottom shelf in the grocery store. Nobody cares. But if we're looking at a new Lamborghini or a new yacht or a new airplane, we have to be very mindful of the market and the suppliers. So, in essence, it's a perception that somebody's being fooled. That's the reason we have a positively sloped supply curve. Now we can calculate elasticity just like we did on demand. In this first case up here, a perfectly inelastic supply curve, and we can see a perfectly inelastic supply curve. If you look at college football, there's some teams that have sold out their stadiums for decades in advance. Their supply curve is perfectly inelastic. Now, let's say they have a 100,000 seat stadium and they sell them all out, that means this is inelastic, and people will pay whatever they want, whatever they're willing to pay to get those tickets to some extent. Now, if they add additional seats, say to 120,000, we would have to see how the consumer responds. We have to know that there's actually people out there that will fill those 20,000 seats before we build them. But this is a perfectly inelastic supply curve, so you can see that. Here we have an inelastic supply curve. And if there's a 22% change in price, we'll see a 10% change in quantity. So this curve is inelastic. So all they're going to do is, if they can, is push the price higher and higher. Gasoline and oil has an inelastic supply curve. They also have an inelastic demand curve. We'll come across, say here. So we have to pay attention to what's going on in that marketplace. Uh, I think I heard right that Turkey has found an enormous supply of fuel or oil and natural gas in their country. So I'm saying they could be a bigger supplier than Saudi Arabia or the U.S. To see how that works out. Here we see a situation where elasticity of supply is increased by 22%, which leads to a 22% increase in quantity supply. Excuse me. That's where we have unit elasticity of supply at this number. It's between 100 and 1, between 5 and 4, which would be 4.5. Now we can see this is just moving along the supply curve. There's no movement of the supply curve in this case. Here we have an elastic supply curve. And if we're selling exotic cars and yachts and airplanes, our supply curve is going to be somewhat elastic. Our demand curve will be somewhat elastic. So any changes in price will have a dramatic impact on the supplier of those goods. Hatteras Yacht Company. They had a demand curve that looked like this. The supply curve as such. And it gave them an equilibrium here. Well, the government decided to put in no, there should be an E on the slip. The government instituted a wealth tax or luxury tax on yachts. When the government did that, it doesn't matter if it's to the supplier or to the consumer. If the tax is added to the supplier, so when they title or complete the yacht, they have to pay a fee or a tax. If that's the case, you'll see the supply fall. When supply falls, you'll see a dramatic change in quantity. But what actually happened was they put it on the backside with the consumers. So the new demand curve came down like this. And our directional arrows are signifying the move from left to right, not up and down. And we can see the new intercept point for quantity. And our new price. We don't see a large change in price, but look at the change we see in quantity. Now, when that luxury tax was put in place, the intent was to make the wealthy pay their fair share. This was done in the late 70s, early 80s. Hatteras Yacht Company went bankrupt because of it. And everything was based on the slopes of their curves. They also put a luxury tax on airplanes and exotic cars. Well, the exotic cars were not in the U.S. at that time, but airplanes and boats were. Both of those industries took a major hit. And if you look at Hatteras Yacht Company, they're located in Washington, North Carolina, referred to as Little Washington. They had to lay off workers. They were a major employer of highly skilled craftspeople, woodworkers, electricians, body work, painting, machining. So they were a major supplier, a major employer supplying a lot of money to the marketplace. When their workers stopped working, the entire city suffered because the amount of income that came in, these individuals didn't buy new cars, they didn't buy new houses. They didn't even know if they'd have a place to live tomorrow. So whenever I get to the elasticity of curves, supply and demand, it's important to understand what makes them move and who is affected at the greatest rate. If you've got an elastic demand curve, you can't play with the price much. If you're a supplier and your supply curve is elastic, you're playing with fire if you play with the price a whole lot, because the consumers will walk away. You could actually have something like this, where it's perceived that the supply for the marketplace is perfectly elastic. Just like we saw with the demand curve. On the demand curve, if the price of the product was 4, as long as it was 4 or less, the consumer would buy everything in an infinite supply, in infinite amounts. Now, on the supply curve, if we have an elastic, a perfectly elastic supply curve, now we're looking at a situation where if the price is above $4 or equal to $4, the consumers will buy everything. So it's infinite. But if you go below 4, it's 0. So they're telling you that they're not going to give you anything below 4, period. So when we look at responsiveness of X to Y and supply in this perfect elasticity situation, it's very responsive because it goes from infinity to 0. That's highly responsive. Now, in this situation, it's showing a nonlinear curve. It's increasing at an increasing rate. And if we were to calculate elasticity of this curve as we move from left to right, the first part is elastic. As we move from 3 to 4, look at the quantity change. For $1, it's another 100 units. But here, when we go from 12 to 15, it goes from 500 to 225. 500 to 525. So there's only a 25 unit change here with a $3 change. So that is elastic. The elasticity is small or less than 1, or basically inelastic. The next one they're going to show us moving for wheat. It's just the demand for wheat is inelastic. It increases the quantity from 100 to 110. We'll see a dramatic drop in price. They give an example. One of the things that I read, they were asking if new technology in the production of wheat increased the yield by 20%. Is that good or bad? And that's what you're seeing here. It's good for the consumer because the price is going down, but the farmer, that advancement in technology to produce additional goods, all it's going to do is drive down the price of the wheat and their profit on the wheat. So as a farmer, you need to know what's going on in your markets, what the curves look like. Now, if you had the ability to go from wheat to corn and pick up the rest, you can use that 20% yield, produce the same quantity with less acreage. Now you have acreage to produce something else. But in most cases, when we have an extra supply on inelastic curves, this could be gasoline and oil, we'll see the price fall. A lot of it's just common sense. Just think of yourself as the consumer and the business person. Here, the oil market is in short run, curve is inelastic. In the long run, the curve is elastic. So we can see it rotating around the demand curve. In this long run, we also see the demand curve flatten out. Turkey came up with additional reserves. We should see these curves flatten out. Now, if OPEC wants to reduce the quantity of oil, now that there's a couple other major players in the marketplace, I think Turkey, they were going to be online in 2022 or 23. It could have a huge impact on oil supply. They'd probably give us enough for another 100 or 250 years. But in the long run, we're going to find a better way. Hydrogen fuel cells, there's a lot of technology out there being worked on to get away from the carbon-based fuels. It's just not cost effective yet. Here's they're dealing with the war on drugs, and the two graphs that they use, because there's two options. You can go after the dealers and arrest all the dealers and throw them in jail. What you're going to see is a reduction in supply. Now the price will go up dramatically and the quantity will go down, but it doesn't solve the problem. If we have more seats available or beds available to assist individuals, not just once a week to give them methadone, but to help them get off of the drugs. Doesn't mean we stop trying to stop the drugs from coming across the border from Asia or Europe or Colombia. It doesn't matter where, but that will still go on. But it will get the greatest impact if we can reduce the number of people that demand the drugs. And a lot of that is based on rehab. So if we can set up a situation for rehab as confinement, we'll have a greater impact on the war on drugs. Now, some people will re-enter the drug market, but hopefully, if it's properly delivered and with skills and everything else, this is what you want to see. Any questions on this? Any at all? Now here are the determinants of elasticity. You know these. The availability of in closeness to substitutes. If there is no one around for 100 miles that sells the same product I do, let's say I'm the last gas station before you start your trip across the desert, the only one around, my curve is going to be inelastic. So in this case, we see the curve like that. And if I raise the price, I'll lose a little quantity, but big deal. In this case, when I raise the price, my total revenue is increasing. Now, if there's a substitute right across the street, it's going to look like this. It's going to be more elastic. Because if I charge $2.50 per gallon and they charge $2.10 a gallon, the consumer is going to move over to their pumps. Okay? Now, necessities versus luxuries. As I said with the table salt, the table salt curve is just about perfectly inelastic. I don't know when the last time was I bought table salt. Maybe 2 years ago, 3. When I go to the grocery store and I have salt on my shopping list, I do not get on my hands and knees and compare price per unit. Doesn't matter. I'm going to grab the one with a little umbrella on it and I'm gone. I don't care. It doubled the price from 2017. I would not know it. Now, if I'm a legislator and I want to tax things that are going to bring me money, those are the type of things you want to tax. When you tax those items with these elastic curves, you're going to see a huge impact on consumption. The luxuries, just like I was saying with hetero shotgun, that's a luxury. If you add a tax to it, quantities can go down dramatically. You'll see a curve that looks like this. And if I raise the price, just a little bit, look at the impact on quantity. You see a dramatic change in quantity with that increase in price. It doesn't matter where the price increase came from. If the consumer is aware of this additional fee or tax is being applied, most of them already have their yachts that are 2 or 3 years old. They'll just keep it. So when the government did that, they placed a luxury tax on these items with the intent of making the rich pay their fair share. That's the logic behind it. What happened is the rich just didn't buy. And when they didn't buy, you had tradespeople, you had contractors, you had woodworkers, you had electricians. All those individuals were now without work. The people that had the money decided to do something else. The Bureau of General Accounting Office in Congress did a study of that luxury tax and the impact it had on revenue. There was the expectation by placing this luxury tax on that everybody's going to keep buying as normal, You see a great windfall and the taxes being collected. They determined it was more expensive to have the luxury tax than to not have it, because they had to pay unemployment, they had to pay for health benefits, food stamps, everything. It actually cost more than they ever received from that tax. So that's when they decided to get rid of it. Now, if we narrowly define a market, if we just say food, that's a broad market, just saying food. We'll be talking peanut butter and jelly sandwiches or filet mignon. It's food. So the broader the definition or the what we're looking at, the more inelastic it'll be. Now, as we narrow down the markets, we'll become more elastic. So we narrow it down to T-bone steaks or to Honey Nut Cheerios or whatever. You will see that curve become more elastic because more competition is going to be available. Okay. And the last one is time. Over time, we looked at the gas. We said, yeah, that was inelastic. There's demand for gas, and the supply was the same way. That's a short run. And like I said, Turkey's come up with found a new supply. So what has happened is, over time, you'll see that demand curve in the long run become more elastic. And how do we know that? It's because we never stop refining what we have. And if we look at our country itself, it's only 200 some years old, 250 years old. That's just a drop in the bucket when we look at civilization and the evolution of civilization in Europe and Middle East. So any product over time is going to become more elastic. Well, not that elastic. And with fuel, we're going to find another way. We will find another way. We're on the process of it now. So we will find a better way to move vehicles from point A to point B and move people from point A to point B. And just speaking of time itself, I started out at high school working on airplanes. I left as a VP and director for a major regional carrier before a recession and new CEO, and I decided I would go back to school. But I was running a few small airports back in the 80s. And one of the individuals I met was a gentleman named Turner Salter, who was born over around Coates. And when I flew with him, he was the oldest living active pilot in the world. I think he was about 93, 94 at the time. And in talking with him, he took his pilot's lessons from the first aviation instructor in North Carolina. And his license were signed off by one of the Wright brothers. We went from jumping off sand dunes and thinking that 120 some feet was amazing. So now we're talking about going to Mars. It would manned flights. So time does change. The Wright brothers could never conceive what is going on today. They could have hoped, and fantasized, but I doubt they would have any clue it would have come this far. And it's the same thing with us today. You don't even know what the difference. You grew up on smartphones and internet. Your children and great grandchildren are going to say, "How did they survive?" Because I guarantee you they're going to have something new and better available to them. And they'll look at your time here on this spinning orb and say, how hard it must have been for you to survive. So it's always going to change. And if we believe it's not going to change, we've lost hope. As long as people are willing to go out there and redefine markets, we're in good shape. As long as we're having individuals out there that want to build a better mousetrap or a better propulsion system or better home manufacturing, we'll see evolution. We'll see continuous change. Any questions, comments about these? Here's some midpoint formula I showed you. They're going to show you how to compute it. So, well, this is just basically repeating what I was telling you. Okay. But I did go into a little greater detail on the calculation of elasticity. So do I have any questions, comments about anything? Nothing? Is anybody here? No, Alexis is here. Next week, I'm going to want to see faces. Okay. They did come across and say that instructors should mandate that if you have webcam access, that you utilize it. And if you got a smartphone, that access. Okay. Ethan, what was the question, Ethan?
Oh, I was just saying that I had
Remember what
had.
it was? Just let me know, and I'll try to resolve it. Now, this is week 3. Next week is week 4. We'll have chapter 6. We'll also you need to start preparing for your thesis and outline and test 1. I will open up all the chapters first of next week, so everything's available for you to study and prepare for test 1. I'm going to set up a discussion room where you can post your thesis and outlines. We will discuss them. If we just put your student ID number on for the time being, not your name, I can bring them up because one day in class I want to go through all of them. Okay, and I'll make suggestions. Doesn't mean you have to respond to me, but I want you to be able to follow along and listen to the suggestions. They're not mandatory, they're just suggestions.